The air atop Mount Olympus was thick with the scent of ambrosia and the faint hum of divine energy. The marble floors of Zeus's grand temple shimmered under the golden light of the eternal sun, and the distant echoes of mortal prayers rose like whispers from the world below. I stood at the edge of the temple's courtyard, my bare feet cold against the polished stone, feeling utterly out of place. My name is Alecto, and I am no god. I am a mortal, a prophetess from Argos, chosen by the fates to deliver a message that could change everything. The weight of their words pressed against my chest like a stone, and I clutched the edges of my threadbare cloak as I approached the throne of Zeus. The king of the gods sat before me, his presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. His beard was as white as the clouds that swirled around Olympus, and his eyes glowed with the intensity of a storm. Yet, for all his power, there was a weariness in his gaze, a burden that even the gods could not escape. "Speak, mortal," Zeus commanded, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "What message do the fates send through you?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The words of the prophecy burned in my mind, and I knew that once I spoke them, there would be no turning back. "When the king of gods weds the mortal crown," I began, my voice trembling, "the threads of fate shall unravel, and Olympus itself shall tremble." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Zeus leaned forward, his brow furrowed, and the other gods, gathered in the shadows of the temple, exchanged uneasy glances. "What does it mean?" Zeus demanded, his voice sharp. "I do not know," I admitted. "The fates showed me only the words, not their meaning. But they said it is a warning, a sign that the balance of the world is at risk." Hera, Zeus's queen, stepped forward, her golden robes shimmering like the sun. Her eyes, cold and calculating, bore into me. "A mortal prophecy brought to Olympus by a mortal girl," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "How convenient. Perhaps the fates have grown tired of us." Zeus raised a hand, silencing her. "The fates do not act without reason," he said, his tone thoughtful. "If they have sent this girl, then we must heed their warning." I shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their gazes. I had always been skeptical of the gods, seeing them as distant and capricious beings who played with mortal lives like pieces on a game board. But now, standing before them, I could see the cracks in their divine facade. Zeus, for all his power, seemed burdened by the responsibility of his role, and Hera's bitterness was palpable. "What do you propose, husband?" Hera asked, her voice sharp. "Shall we unravel the threads of fate ourselves?" Zeus ignored her, his gaze fixed on me. "You will remain here, Alecto," he said. "You are the bearer of this prophecy, and you will help us decipher its meaning." My heart sank. I had hoped to deliver the message and return to my quiet life in Argos, far from the intrigues of the gods. But I knew better than to argue. As the gods debated among themselves, I wandered to the edge of the temple, where the clouds parted to reveal the mortal world below. The city-states of Greece sprawled across the land like scattered jewels, their fates intertwined with the whims of the gods. I thought of Leonidas, the king of Sparta, whose name had been whispered in the fates' vision. What role did he play in this prophecy? And what did it mean for Zeus to wed the mortal crown? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I had always believed that the gods controlled our destinies, that their will was absolute. But the prophecy suggested something else entirely, an unraveling of fate, a shift in the balance of power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the temple in shadows, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. The threads of fate were beginning to unravel, and I was caught in the center of the storm. Little did I know the unraveling had already begun. The days on Olympus blurred together, each one longer and more surreal than the last. I, Alecto, the mortal prophetess, had become an unwilling guest in the realm of the gods. The grandeur of the temple, the shimmering halls, and the ever-present hum of divine energy were a constant reminder of how out of place I was. Yet I could not leave. The prophecy had bound me to this place, and Zeus's command was absolute. Zeus had called a council of the gods to discuss the prophecy. They gathered in the great hall, their forms towering and radiant, their voices echoing like thunder. I stood at the edge of the room, small and insignificant, clutching the edges of my cloak as I listened. "The prophecy speaks of the unraveling of fate," Zeus began, his voice resonating through the hall. "But what does it mean to wed the mortal crown? Is it a warning or a riddle?" Hera, seated beside him, scoffed. "It is nonsense," she said, her voice sharp. "A mortal's attempt to sow discord among us. We should cast her out and forget this folly." Athena, the goddess of wisdom, stepped forward, her gray eyes thoughtful. "The fates do not speak idly," she said. "If they have sent this prophecy, we must consider its meaning. Perhaps it is a test, a challenge to our understanding of fate and free will." Zeus nodded, his expression grave. "I have decided to test the prophecy," he declared. "For 1 year, I will relinquish my divine influence over a mortal king. We shall see if mortals can rule themselves without our guidance." The gods murmured among themselves, some intrigued, others skeptical. Hera's eyes narrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She did not trust mortals, and she did not trust me. "Which king will you choose?" Poseidon asked, his voice deep and rumbling. "Leonidas of Sparta," Zeus replied. "He is strong, wise, and just. If any mortal can rule without divine intervention, it is he." I felt a chill run down my spine. Leonidas. The name had been whispered in the Fates' vision, and now it was spoken aloud. What role did he play in this prophecy? And what would happen when the gods stepped back? As the council dispersed, I found myself wandering the halls of the temple, my mind racing. The gods' plan was bold, but it was also dangerous. If Leonidas failed, it would prove Hera right, that mortals were incapable of ruling themselves. But if he succeeded, it could change everything. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice Hera approaching until she was right beside me. "You think yourself clever, don't you?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "A mortal girl playing with the threads of fate. But you are nothing more than a pawn in a game you cannot hope to understand." I met her gaze, trying to hide my fear. "I am only the messenger," I said. "The fates chose me, not the other way around." Hera's lips curled into a cold smile. "We shall see," she said. "But know this, if you interfere, if you try to sway the outcome, you will regret it." She turned and walked away, her golden robes shimmering in the dim light. I stood there, my heart pounding, knowing that I had made an enemy of the queen of the gods. In the mortal world, Leonidas of Sparta awoke to a strange silence. For the first time in his life, he could not feel the presence of the gods. The omens that had once guided his decisions were gone, and the whispers of divine favor had fallen silent. At first, he was unnerved. The gods had always been a part of his rule, their will shaping the destiny of Sparta. But as the days passed, he began to feel something he had never felt before: freedom. Without the gods' influence, Leonidas was forced to rely on his own judgment. He consulted his advisors, listened to his people, and made decisions based on reason rather than divine decree. To his surprise, the city flourished. Trade increased, alliances were forged, and the people of Sparta grew stronger and more united. But not everyone was pleased. In Athens, whispers of Sparta's success reached the ears of its leaders. They saw Leonidas's independence as a threat, a challenge to their own power. Tensions between the city-states began to rise, and the fragile peace that had held Greece together started to unravel. Back on Olympus, I watched these events unfold with growing unease. Zeus had tasked me with observing Leonidas's rule, and I spent my days gazing into the celestial pool, its waters showing me glimpses of the mortal world. What I saw both inspired and terrified me. Leonidas was proving that mortals could rule themselves, but his success was stirring up old rivalries and jealousies. The balance of power in Greece was shifting, and the god's absence was creating a vacuum that others were eager to fill. One evening, as I sat by the pool, Zeus approached me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, pride, perhaps, or regret. "What do you see, Alecto?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I see a world on the brink of change," I replied. "Leonidas is proving that mortals can rule themselves, but his success is causing unrest. The other city-states fear him, and some seek to undermine him." Zeus nodded, his gaze distant. "And what of the prophecy? Do you see its meaning yet?" I hesitated. The words of the prophecy echoed in my mind. "When the king of gods weds the mortal crown, the threads of fate shall unravel, and Olympus itself shall tremble." "I think the mortal crown is not a king," I said slowly. "It is the sovereignty of mortals, their ability to rule themselves. The unraveling of fate is not a catastrophe, but a liberation. The gods must step back and allow mortals to forge their own destinies. Zeus was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of centuries. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "But liberation comes at a cost. The mortals are not ready for this power. They will tear each other apart, or they will rise to the challenge," I said, my voice firm. "They are stronger than you think." Zeus looked at me, his eyes piercing. "We shall see," he said. As the year drew to a close, the tension in Greece reached a boiling point. Hera, ever the schemer, saw an opportunity to prove her point. She conspired with Ares, the god of war, to incite a rebellion in Sparta. "If Leonidas falls," she said, her voice cold, "it will prove that mortals cannot rule themselves. The gods must intervene or chaos will consume the world." Ares, always eager for conflict, agreed. Together, they planted seeds of discord among Sparta's allies, whispering lies and sowing distrust. I watched in horror as the rebellion began to take shape. Leonidas, unaware of the gods' interference, tried to quell the unrest, but the damage had been done. The threads of fate were unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. As the sun set on the final day of the year, I stood at the edge of the temple, gazing down at the mortal world. The storm was coming, and I could only hope that Leonidas would find a way to weather it. Little did I know the unraveling was far from over. The rebellion in Sparta began like a spark in dry grass, small but fierce. Hera and Ares had done their work well, planting seeds of doubt and discord among Sparta's allies. Whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire, and soon the fragile alliance Leonidas had built began to crumble. I watched from Olympus, my heart heavy with dread. The celestial pool showed me glimpses of the chaos below. Armies gathering, cities preparing for war, and Leonidas struggling to hold his kingdom together. The threads of fate were unraveling faster than I could have imagined, and I felt powerless to stop it. Zeus, too, watched the events unfold, his expression grim. He had sworn not to intervene, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. The king of the gods was torn between his oath and his desire to protect the mortals he had ruled over for centuries. "What will you do?" I asked him one evening as we stood together in the temple courtyard. The air was thick with tension, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the heavens. "I do not know," Zeus admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "If I intervene, I break my oath and prove Hera right. But if I do nothing, the mortals will destroy themselves. Perhaps they will surprise you," I said, though I was not sure I believed it myself. Zeus looked at me, his eyes piercing. "You have more faith in them than I do," he said. In the mortal world, Leonidas faced the rebellion with a courage that inspired his people. He knew the gods had abandoned him, but he refused to let despair take hold. Instead, he turned to his advisors, his soldiers, and his people, rallying them with words of unity and strength. "We do not need the gods to guide us," he declared, standing before the assembled armies of Sparta. "We have the strength within ourselves to protect our home and our future. Let us show the world what mortals can achieve when we stand together." His words stirred something deep within the hearts of his people. They had grown accustomed to relying on the gods for guidance, but now they saw the power of their own will. The armies of Sparta marched to meet the rebels, their spirits high and their resolve unshakable. But the rebellion was not so easily quelled. Ares, the god of war, had imbued the rebels with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They fought with a reckless abandon, their eyes burning with divine fury. The battle was fierce and bloody, and the fields of Sparta ran red with the blood of both sides. Back on Olympus, I could no longer bear to watch. The celestial pool showed me only death and destruction, and I felt a growing sense of despair. I had believed in the prophecy, in the idea that mortals could rule themselves, but now I wondered if I had been wrong. Hera found me in the temple gardens, her golden robes shimmering in the dim light. She wore a cold smile, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Do you see now, little prophetess?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is what happens when mortals are left to their own devices. Chaos, destruction, death." I met her gaze, my fear giving way to anger. "You did this," I said. "You and Ares. You sowed the seeds of this rebellion, and now you gloat over the consequences." Hera's smile widened. "Of course I did," she said. "I had to prove a point. The mortals are weak, and they need the gods to guide them. Without us, they are nothing." "You're wrong," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "They are stronger than you think. And they will prove it, no matter what you do. Hera laughed, a sound as cold as the winter wind. We shall see, she said. As the battle raged on, Leonidas found himself face to face with the leader of the rebellion, a man named Thuron. Once a trusted ally, Thuron had been swayed by the whispers of betrayal and the promise of power. You cannot win, Leonidas, Thuron said, his voice filled with venom. The gods have abandoned you. Your people will fall and Sparta will be mine. Leonidas met his gaze, his expression calm and resolute. The gods may have abandoned us, he said, but we do not need them. We have each other and that is enough. With a roar, Leonidas charged at Thuron, his sword flashing in the sunlight. The two men clashed, their blades ringing out like thunder. It was a battle of wills as much as strength, and in the end, it was Leonidas who emerged victorious. Thuron fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. How, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Because I fight for something greater than myself, Leonidas said. I fight for my people, for their future, and for their freedom. The death of Thuron marked the turning point of the battle. The rebels, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat. The armies of Sparta pressed their advantage, driving the enemy back and reclaiming their land. As the sun set on the battlefield, Leonidas stood amidst the ruins, his heart heavy with the cost of victory. He had proven that mortals could rule themselves, but the price had been high. On Olympus, Zeus watched the events unfold with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. You were right, he said. The mortals are stronger than I thought. I nodded, my heart swelling with hope. The prophecy was not a warning, I said. It was a call for balance. The gods must step back and allow mortals to forge their own destinies. Zeus sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of centuries. Perhaps you are right, he said. But the unraveling of fate is not yet complete. There is still much to be done. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, I felt a strange sense of peace. The threads of fate were still unraveling, but I knew that the mortals would rise to the challenge. They had proven their strength, and now it was up to the gods to accept their new role. Little did I know the unraveling was far from over. The aftermath of the rebellion in Sparta was a time of both triumph and sorrow. Leonidas had proven that mortals could rule themselves, but the cost had been high. The fields of Sparta were littered with the fallen, and the air was heavy with the cries of the grieving. Yet, amidst the devastation, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that something profound had shifted in the balance of power between gods and mortals. On Olympus, the gods gathered in the great hall, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. Zeus stood at the center, his presence commanding yet contemplative. The success of Leonidas's rule without divine intervention had shaken the foundations of their belief in their own necessity. The mortals have proven their strength, Zeus declared, his voice resonating through the hall. They have shown that they can rule themselves, that they do not need us to guide their every step. Hera, seated beside him, glared at the assembled gods, her eyes burning with defiance. This is folly, she said, her voice sharp. The mortals are weak and foolish. Without our guidance, they will destroy themselves. Athena stepped forward, her gray eyes thoughtful. Perhaps it is not weakness but strength that we have witnessed, she said. The mortals have shown that they are capable of greatness, even without our intervention. Zeus nodded, his expression grave. The prophecy was not a warning but a call for balance, he said. The unraveling of fate was not destruction but liberation. The gods must step back and allow mortals to forge their own destinies. The gods murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The idea of relinquishing their control over mortals was a radical one, and not all were ready to accept it. In the mortal world, Leonidas stood before his people, his heart heavy with the weight of his victory. He had proven that mortals could rule themselves, but he knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. We have faced the storm and emerged stronger, he declared, his voice ringing out across the assembled crowd. But our journey is far from over. We must continue to stand together to protect our home and our future. The people of Sparta cheered, their spirits lifted by his words. They had proven their strength, and now they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Back on Olympus, I, Alecto, stood at the edge of the temple, gazing down at the mortal world. The threads of fate were still unraveling, but I knew that the mortals would rise to the challenge. They had proven their strength, and now it was up to the gods to accept their new role. Zeus approached me, his expression unreadable. "You were right," he said. "The mortals are stronger than I thought." I nodded, my heart swelling with hope. "The prophecy was not a warning," I said. "It was a call for balance. The gods must step back and allow mortals to forge their own destinies." Zeus sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of centuries. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "But the unraveling of fate is not yet complete. There is still much to be done." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, I felt a strange sense of peace. The threads of fate were still unraveling, but I knew that the mortals would rise to the challenge. They had proven their strength, and now it was up to the gods to accept their new role. Zeus turned to me, his eyes piercing. "You have done well, Alecto," he said. "You have shown us a new path, a new way of understanding our place in the world." I smiled, a sense of fulfillment washing over me. "The threads of fate are not chains but choices," I said, "woven by the hands of gods and mortals alike. To unravel them is not to destroy, but to create anew." Zeus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps it is time for a new era," he said. "An era of balance, where gods and mortals work together to shape the future." As the story drew to a close, I stood at the edge of the temple, gazing up at the stars. A new constellation was forming in the night sky, a sign of the gods' evolving relationship with mortals. I smiled, knowing that the story of gods and men was far from over. The threads of fate had unraveled, but in their place, a new tapestry was being woven, one of hope, freedom, and the boundless potential of mortals and gods alike.